A very good morning. This is Dr. Neelofar Kohri from Government Girls College, Bikaner. And today, although I'm very late, actually, last lecture I prepared was on progress of poesy, and on recording that lecture, I had demand of The Bard by Thomas Gray. So now I'm here again with you people to share the poem The Bard. So, in this lecture, we are going to discuss the introductory part or synopsis of the poem, like Gray's other poems, Progress of Poesy and other, and all. The Bard is again a very obscure kind of poem, so it's not easy to go through in one lecture. So, we are going to read the introduction and synopsis of the poem in this lecture, and later in further lectures, we will be discussing the poem itself. Okay, so The Bard, which is titled as The Bard, a Pindaric Ode by Thomas Gray. The poem was written between March 1755 and May 1757. After completing the progress of poesy, Gray wrote to a friend that he had two or three ideas more in his head, and one of these ideas was most probably the bard. But the poem was written by fits and starts and does not represent the product of a single effort. For instance, when two-thirds of the poem had been written, Gray's creative energy suddenly flagged, and in mid October 1755, he admitted that he had not done a word more of the part, having been in very listless, unpleasant, and inutile state of mind for this long while. And in a letter written in January 1756, he said that he had still added nothing to what he had written of his poem, this poem in the previous manner. So late in April 1756, he explained to a friend that his inspiration was apt to fail him before he came to a conclusion in writing the poem. And by the end of 1756, he had still made no further progress with the poem, but eventually the poem was completed in fits and starts in May 1757. And when the poem was complete, Gray advertised the poem in the following words. He said the following ode is founded on a tradition current in Wales that Edward I, when he completed the conquest of that country, ordered all the bards that fell into his hands to be put to death. And this is what actually the theme of the poem is. And Gray's source of this tradition can be found uh, in a passage in Thomas Carter's General History of England concerning Edward I's campaigns in Wales. And he actually has written a passage. Gray has given the introduction of the passage, which runs like this. The only set of men among the Welsh that had no reason to complain, that had reason to complain of Edward's severity were the bards, who used to put those remains of the ancient Britons in mind of the valiant deeds of their ancestors, and he ordered them all to be hanged as inciters of the people to sedition. Politics in this point got the better of the king's natural lenity, and those who were afterwards entrusted with the government of the country, following his example, the profession becoming dangerous, gradually declined, and in a little time that sort of man was utterly destroyed. And this is what actually Gray felt, that when King Edward, as per the tradition, used to order of the execution of the bards or the poets who were actually the patriot poets, and the patriotism which Edward first did not like to be continued. So Gray, as he was a very voracious reader of medieval history and literature, he actually was affected much by this, and he then wrote this poem as a reply to that. So the poem is set at the time of Edward I's conquest of Wales, inspired partly by his researches into medieval history and literature, partly by his discovery of Welsh harp music, and it was itself a potent influence on future generations of poets and painters, seen by many as the first creative work of the Celtic revival and as lying at the root of the Romantic movement in Britain. The Celtic revival, which actually talks about the revival of poetry and literature, basically the Welsh or Irish or Scottish poetry and literature. So some other time we'll have a detailed lecture on Celtic revival itself. So the poem, the copyright of the poem along with the progress of poesy was sold to Robert Dodsley, and Dodsley issued them together under the titles Odes by Mr. Gray, and the book was printed by Gray's friend Horace Walpole. Actually, it was reprinted by Horace Walpole because he recently had, established his first printing press, and he published his poems. And the books were actually sold for 1 shilling, and it was a great success for Gray. So, the synopsis, let's have a quick look at the theme of the poem or what it actually talks about. So the poem, as the it's about the victorious Edward I. As the victorious army of Edward I marches along the slopes of Snowdonian mountains near to the rear Conwy, they encounter a Welsh bard who curses the king. The bard invokes the shades of Cadwallo, Urien, and Mordred, three of Edward's victims, who weave the fate of Edward's Plantagenet line, dwelling on the various miseries and misfortunes of his descendants. The bard goes on to predict the return of Welsh rule over Britain in the form of the House of Tudor and the following of British poetry in the verse of Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton. And he finally tells Edward, which is actually the zeal of the poem, with joy I see the different dooms of our fates assign, be thine despair and sceptred care, to triumph and to die are mine. He spoke, and headlong from the mountain's height, deep in the roaring tide, he plunged to endless night. So this is the end of the poem where the bard who curses the king Edward I for the massacre of bards or poets or killing of the poets, Welsh poets, and because they were patriot and they used to talk about their country, they used to talk about their places. So the bard or the poet which actually curses King Edward, and so and after cursing him, he commits suicide. That is the sad end of the poem, but at the same time he feels very triumphant because he feels that after his death the king has to be, king would be forced to think about what the bard has actually said. So the poem can be divided in various parts. The first part, we can say, as I have divided it for the convenience, is the bard's song. The bard stood on a rock with wild eyes and loose hair. Okay, and his song was full of prophetic fire. Addressing Edward first, he said that the branches of oak trees were like arms waving over king's head and threatening him with revenge of Welsh people. Okay, so the poem, which is actually a beginning with a curse uttered by the last surviving bard as he addresses Edward I, who, with his huge army, was toiling down the mountain slopes in the area called Snowdown, where the river Conway is forming flood, and the hills are lofty and thickly wooded. And the bard said, "May rain and confusion descend upon you, merciless king. Not all your weapons and all your virtues will save you from the pangs of your guilty conscience and from the curse of the Welsh people." The words of the bard caused dismay in the king's heart and made a terrible impact on his generals like the Earl of Gloucester and Mortimer, the Lord of Wigmore. So, when we'll be discussing the poem in details, we will talk about these characters also. So, it was a tradition on which the poem is based. Actually, this tradition is not historically authentic, but as per the tradition, as it is written in the books, Edward I ordered all Welsh bards to be murdered after he had conquered Wales, and his motive was to prevent them from writing patriotic poems in order to stir feelings of rebellion in the Welsh people against the conquerors. The tradition, however, is valid enough for poetic treatment. Okay, so the bard sings this song, and this after the bard sings the song, the poets, which actually to whom the bard mentioned, are dead. They are like Cadwallo, Urian, and Modred, who had the power to tame the raging ocean and bend the high mountain. They are all dead. So the poets are dead, but the bard sees their ghosts in the distance. So even birds of prey do not dare to come near their dead bodies, because to the bard his fellow poets were as dear as the sight of his eyes and the drops of his blood. But he must not weep, as he sees on the distant cliffs a crowd of ghosts of the dead poets. And the ghosts of dead poets sing in chorus and speak of the fate of King Edward II, which he is about to meet. So the ghost and the chorus of the ghosts and the prophecy and the fate of King Edward II, which they are going to meet in future, means the coming generations of King Edward first. What is the fate which they are going to meet? It's all discussed in the for next parts of the poem. So the ghost of the dead Welsh poet now sing in chorus, in which the bard also joins, and they weave as it were a web depicting the fate that is in store for the descendants of Edward first. The ghosts foresee, first of all, the agonizing death of Edward II to be cruelly butchered in Berkeley Castle. Then they foretell the invasion of France by Edward III, the son of Edward II, and Isabella, the shelf of France. Edward III says the ghost would hover over his mother's native land like scourge of heaven. And when the prophecy continues, they say and announce the War of Roses and murder in the Tower of London, okay, and the reign of Richard the Third. So Edward III, who would be a mighty conqueror and mighty ruler, will die unattended by anyone and abandoned by all. His son, the Black Prince, will have died a year before. The courtiers who used to crowd around Edward III will now go to pay their homage to the new king, Richard II, and Richard II will enjoy all the pleasures of life during his reign, but he will ultimately be starved to death. And when the prophecy continues, they talk about the War of Roses and the murders in Tower of London. Um Civil War, we have must have heard about the War of Roses, which is going to rage for many years, and friend will turn against friend and brother against brother. There will be much bloodshed, and Henry VI, George Duke of Clarence, Edward V, rich Duke of York, etc., will be murdered in Tower of London. So murder in cathedral, there is a poem by T.S. Eliot over the theme also. And Richard III, the Bristol Boar, would be killed, and Yorkist branch of, means all the things which actually happened after these incidents of the reign of King Edward I, which Gray has read in detail. Gray has gone through in detail. Are actually mentioned in this poem by the poet. And after the ghosts vanish and the chorus ends, the bard sees new scenes of future and sees the glorious vision of Elizabethan age, of Shakespeare, of Milton, of Spenser, and the revival of poetic spirit or Celtic revival. Okay, so this actually is as the theme of the poem. And after this reference of Shakespeare, Milton, means this positive references. After these positive comments, what does the bard do? The bard's fate and King Edward's fate is decided. The bard and King Edward will meet different fates. The king will be filled with despair and will lead a life of anxieties, because he has been told so many, he has been seen so many prophecies, or he had been told so many things by the bard, that now he is going to live all the remaining life in anxiety and despair, and which will be actually inseparable from his kingship. And the bard will die, and actually he will commit a suicide, and he just jumps into the water of the river on which he has been standing, and in his death he proves himself the victor. So having finished what the bard has to say, he plunged headlong from the rock into the roaring torrent of the river below, and thus met his end. So the bard, though the bard meets a sad end, and he dies in a spirit He dies in a spirit of triumph. He has seen in his imagination the rise of the poetic spirit and its several manifestations. He therefore dies contented, and the spirit of poetry is invincible. This is the message of the bard to us, of the bard, of that poet, that particular Welsh bard or Welsh poet, to all of us, that what is going to be, what is going to happen, that he teaches us the lesson of humanity or morality through the by the prophecies, or through the prophecies which he has made about King Edward the First. So the poem, which actually is a Pindaric ode, and the metrical scheme and the fluidity and the strictness which Gray follows in this poem are really remarkable, and we are going to discuss them in further lectures. And this bard of whom Gray is talking about is a 13th century Welsh bard, and who is talking about is in a situation of wildness and terror. And actually, for the Pindaric odes, which are actually serious in the matter, serious in their content, these kind of themes are appropriate. The poem carries a unity into itself, and the mood also varies throughout the poem. The poem is a prophetic poem, and it's a kind of sublime, but yes, it carries the obscurity which Gray carries or contains in his poem. So, that's all. I guess that by going through this, you will be able to, understand the theme of the poem, the bard. And later we are going to discuss the poem in detail along with text. So thank you very much for now. See you soon. Thank you.